We now return for 4 sessions in a row rather than the usual 3. We are going to be talking about donor, philanthropic, university, and NGO responses, and we'll also be joined by Reverend Barber at the end of this set of sessions. We begin with Adam Gamoran, who is the president of the W.T. Grant Foundation. Wonderful to see you, Adam, again. It's been a long time. And he will be speaking on donor and philanthropic responses. Adam? We see your slides.
Thank you, Carola. Yep, thank you, Carola and Marcelo and everyone for welcoming me to this conference. I am sorry that I'm not there in person. Sounded like a great conversation yesterday afternoon, and I'm sure it will be stimulating this morning or this afternoon as well. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Adam.
Great. So let's see. There we go. So I've been asked to talk about the donor and philanthropic response to the pandemic with respect to children. Of course, no short talk can encompass the vast diversity of responses from the donor sector from the philanthropic sector to the COVID-19 pandemic. As the saying goes, if you know one foundation, you know one foundation. I'll narrow my focus in 2 ways. First of all, I'll zero in on the themes of this conference, children and inequality. And second, I will focus on a particular interest of our foundation, the William T. Grant Foundation, which is based in New York City, which is support for scientific research. So my title, From Action to Research to Action, reflects both the urgency of the present and the salience of the future, the need to plan and to use research as a tool to plan for the long term. I'll discuss 5 topics. First, the philanthropic response to the immediate crisis. Second, the pandemic in the context of multiple crises. Third, inequality within and between nations. Fourth, establishing a new normal that is not like the old normal. And I so appreciated the conversation yesterday afternoon, which made this point. Fernando Reimers and others made this point very strongly yesterday. And last, I will explain the role of research to reduce inequality in child and youth outcomes and the role of philanthropy in supporting such research. So the response from the philanthropic sector to the COVID-19 pandemic has been massive. According to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, more than $32 billion have been donated from foundations and corporations since the start of the pandemic. These efforts, these contributions have focused mainly on mitigation, vaccination, and treatment. Some headliners include the Gates Foundation's dramatic commitment to vaccine development, which has not been without its controversies, but in monetary terms has certainly been large. The Ford Foundations and others issuing bonds to increase their giving at a time of need, in some cases doubling their giving more than they would normally give in this time of need. But this is about the immediate crisis. What about the broader context and the future? We need to understand the global pandemic as a reflection of 4 simultaneous crises. And I'm not the first person to point this out. President Joe Biden and others have made this point. But we're really talking about 4 crises. The first, of course, is the health crisis of COVID-19. But simultaneously, we face the economic crisis wrought by the pandemic, the racial reckoning that has erupted in the US alongside ethnic polarization and violence globally, and the climate crisis, all happening at the same time. So philanthropy's response to the pandemic is not just about health, but all of these arenas. Each has important for the welfare of children, particularly the most vulnerable children. They must be considered and addressed in combination, not singly. Consider inequality within and between nations. So within nations, of course, we witness unequal educational opportunities, unequal access to technology, unequal access to healthcare, racial and ethnic discrimination and prejudice. But at the same time, we also confront inequality between nations that needs to be addressed in part by the philanthropic sector in this time of simultaneous crises. So unequal access to vaccines and treatments, again, the headline. But there's also unequal economic resources, which is the basis for unequal access to vaccines and treatment. Infrastructural disparities. And philanthropy must respond to inequality at both levels. So the immediate crisis response has been to provide first economic support for families with children. And in the United States, this came largely from the federal government, which through essentially a child allowance, provided a tax credit, a refundable tax credit, which cut child poverty by nearly 50%. And this was a remarkable development, something that's been advocated for years, something that our philanthropy and others supported a major national study by the National Academies of Science, documenting what steps were necessary to cut child poverty in half. And lo and behold, with the American Rescue Plan, this plan was actually put into place, and it did indeed cut child poverty in half. Unfortunately, it has not been extended post-pandemic. Second, releasing youth from detention. So youth accused or convicted of crimes are held in detention centers, and during the COVID pandemic, they were vulnerable to illness, and including severe illness. And our foundation supported a research synthesis in conjunction with the National Council of Family and Juvenile Court Judges, which gave judges the tools they need to keep young people out of detention during this health crisis. And it was so important because judges recognize that whatever the sentence for these vulnerable young people, it is not a sentence to illness or hospitalization or even death. And that's what, the pandemic was rampant in detention facilities. And yet judges are in a precarious position because, as you may know, you let out one person who goes on to commit a crime, a subsequent crime, and the pushback you get, it can be ruinous. And so by providing the judges with the tools they need of balancing risk, that they were able to dramatically reduce the number of youth held in detention during the pandemic. This is yet another marker that has snapped back to the old normal, which has levels of detention that are far too high post-pandemic. Support for refugee children. Another effort of our foundation has been to some researchers and workers at World Relief Durham in North Carolina to develop a school curriculum and after-school program to help settle refugee children in that community. And this had a very successful pivot to a virtual format during the pandemic. In fact, so successful that in contrast to the other two responses that I just described, this is continuing in the virtual format post-pandemic. It's a way of reaching parents successfully and has helped both teachers and students accommodate to their situation. And now this community, most recently, this community has received an influx of Afghan refugee children and is applying the same parent engagement resettlement effort to help the refugee children. Reaching vulnerable populations with treatment and vaccine has been another immediate response to the crisis on the part of the donor and philanthropic sector, as well as commitment to technology resources for education. Now, I am going to argue that research to reduce inequality is a key to the new normal. That is a normal that is less fraught with inequality, less fraught with discrimination, less fraught with unequal allocation of resources post-pandemic than pre-pandemic, and therefore would have a better foundation for our most vulnerable children. So this is a four-part argument. First, inequality is excessive. And you can see this in many countries. The US really stands out in excessive inequality, but Thomas Piketty made this argument in Capital in the 21st century across Europe. Second, excessive inequality is harmful. It is socially divisive, and it's a drag on our economic productivity. But third, we are not paralyzed in the face of increasing inequality. On the contrary, inequality responds to social programs and policies. It's demonstrable. And therefore, we need research to identify the programs and policies that effectively reduce inequality. The pandemic makes this agenda even more urgent, and that is the special niche of the William T. Grant Foundation to support research to identify programs and policies that effectively reduce inequality. So as a first step towards this new normal, we can apply lessons from existing research. For example, the US government and philanthropy are combining forces to unfold a massive tutoring effort to address learning loss caused by the pandemic. In addition, we have decades of research on trauma response, which can be applied in education and other settings to try to help children cope with the trauma, loss of caregivers, disruption in their lives, social isolation, all the traumas that young people have experienced during the pandemic. Third is food and housing security, both of which affected during the pandemic. We had a moratorium on evictions that is now ended, so families are once again being evicted from their homes if they're unable to pay their rent, which may be the case due to a loss of provider, a loss of job, or the dramatic inequality that was already afflicting this nation and many others. Juvenile justice reform, as I mentioned, it's one thing to let kids out of detention so they don't get sick and die during a pandemic, but rates of juvenile detention are too high and conditions are too harsh as they are, and so we need reform in juvenile justice, and research can point the way. Immigration reform, we know steps that can be taken successfully to support immigrant origin children and families in the US. One of the most important steps we could take in this country and others is to ensure that immigrant children have access to the social supports and rights that they are entitled, which they often do not receive, and our existing research points to that very strongly. Border policies, inclusion of immigrants in the social safety net, and so on. But new research is also needed. New research is needed to address the intergenerational transmission of poverty. It's one thing to say, all right, if we create a child allowance, that will reduce child poverty because families will have more money. But that is a short-term fix. And what we need is a long-term fix. We need to empower families to raise children so that in the next generation, they will not be based in poverty. And here in the US, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine has just convened a new consensus panel to synthesize the research on stopping the intergenerational transmission of poverty. Second, we need new research on building the social identity of minoritized youth. All too often, responses to addressing the challenges of youth from minority backgrounds, low-income backgrounds, and immigrant communities has been to emphasize assimilation, integration, conformity. But it turns out that building the racial and ethnic identity and fostering a critical consciousness so that young people understand the basis of their circumstances and can push back against it, it may be a more effective way to support the healthy academic and social development of young people from minoritized backgrounds. So research is underway on this. We need more of it, and then ultimately we need to capitalize on it with programs and policies that support the development of young people. So here at the William T. Grant Foundation, we have supported a lot of research on programs and policies to reduce inequality. But it turns out that even if we successfully identify programs that benefit the young, vulnerable youth to which they are targeted, and even if we can scale up those programs to many places, we're still not going to get very far in actually reducing inequality until we disrupt and overturn the structural foundations of racism and economic inequality that created the need for those programs and policies in the first place. I always like to give the example of the growth mindset. You know, the growth mindset is the idea that anyone can succeed. No one is born smart, no one is born dumb. With hard work and effort, all can succeed, all can learn, as compared to a fixed mindset that says that you have what you have and you can't change it. So it turns out that because of discrimination and oppression in our society, young people from minoritized backgrounds often are not have the opportunity to develop the growth mindset. And if you can implement an intervention for the growth mindset, then you can close gaps between disadvantaged and advantaged children. Well, what if we address the conditions of racism and discrimination that create the need for the mindset intervention in the first place? Wouldn't that be a more powerful and lasting way to reduce inequality? So we are calling now for research on social movements and tax redistribution strategies, reparations for descendants of enslaved persons, land return for colonized populations. These are a few examples of research that's needed to establish a new normal that is less unequal than what we've had in the past. Finally, a new modality, a new approach to research is needed. That is research based in community partnership. This claim comes from research on improving the way evidence from research is used in policies and practices that affect young people. Producing high quality research is not enough to get the findings used, even if it is timely, relevant, and accessible. You know, initial evidence to get, and initial efforts to get evidence used recognize that there was a bridge or a gap between research on the one side and practice and policy on the other. So how to get across the bridge? Well, initial efforts focused on building a bridge and moving in one direction, from research to policy. Researchers figure stuff out, and they tell the policymakers and practitioners what they figured out, and then the policymakers will naturally act on these pearls of wisdom. Now, the research needs to have rigor, incentives, translation, and dissemination. We need to tell what we've learned so that others can act. That was the initial conception. It turns out that conception does not work very well. Instead, what is needed is a two-way process where researchers are listening to practitioners and policymakers to jointly develop a research agenda so that it can be pursued together, and so that if questions that practitioners really need answers are pursued in research, then once the findings come out, there's a chance that they would actually be used to improve practice and policy. So this means not only rigor, incentives, translation, and dissemination, but also relevance, engagement, capacity. In short, it's about building relationships between producers and consumers of evidence, and those bridge builders, those intermediaries who knit the two together. Why focus on partnerships? Well, for researchers, it provides an opportunity to understand the local context, to learn about needs and questions, to provide insights that facilitate new research. And at the same time, policymakers and practitioners can also benefit from gaining access to existing research, from contributing to research that is relevant to their context, from receiving assistance with efforts to use research. So this is a matter of changing how we work. It's a way to make sure decision makers' voices are reflected in research agenda, to engage partners who can help us make sense of the research for the local context, to build sustained and trusting relationships, which ultimately increase the chances that research will get used, and to establish organizational routines that create opportunities for learning. So what do we hope to accomplish with these efforts? What is the aim of a philanthropy as we come out of this terrible pandemic? Some funders come up with the answer, and then they want to support research that drives towards that answer. Our approach is different. We start with a question. We count on the research community to provide the responses. Community partnerships help ensure that the right questions are asked, and that the answers are useful. Post-pandemic, we can establish a new normal. Reducing inequality requires political will and research-based knowledge. Thank you.